And today we will start with two main questions. And in the meantime, if you have any question, please use the raise up hand functions at Zoom, or you left your questions at the chat box here. Great. So again, very welcome to Professor Herr. The first questions, as you mentioned out in your video lecture, the depreciation of national currency may bring about desired effects, which can favor the competitiveness of the country, right? So at the same time, it's very challenging and should be under certain conditions. Otherwise, it might cause higher inflation as imported products and services are becoming more expensive. So against this backdrop, how can trade unions demand higher nominal wages to compensate for the falling purchase power of workers in a way not going to defeat the purpose of the depreciation of the national currency? Thanks, Professor. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you again for inviting me. And I think the question you have mentioned is a very difficult and important question, especially for developing countries. The problem we have is let's assume a country has a situation of a current account deficit, and this current account deficit cannot be financed any longer. Then there's no option. You have to depreciate. I mean, the country can go to the International Monetary Fund to ask for help or to other governments, but then it will become very dependent and must follow the policy recommendations, or even they have to follow what the foreign countries demand. But let's discuss what is the problem of a depreciation. And maybe I could mention before I discuss this that Danny Roderick, an economist I really like, he argues a depreciation has the same effect as the implementation of a general tariff. It's a kind of general protection for the domestic economy. And I think for trade unions, this is an important point. They should be happy if the domestic economy is protected from foreign competition. So, but what are the problems when we discuss about a depreciation? I think there are four serious problems. First, and Cheng, you have mentioned it, if we have a depreciation, let's say 10% or so, and we have a high import quota of the country, all imported products will become more expensive. This is to a certain extent, this is what we want. We want that consumers and companies don't import intermediate goods or consumption goods. We want that they buy domestic goods. However, the side effect is that real wages go down. And this is, of course, very problematic for trade unions if real wages go down. And the problem is if they demand a compensation for the cut in real wages and ask for higher nominal wages, then we have a second inflationary push. Yeah, the first one is because of higher import prices. The second, because of higher wage costs. Unfortunately, wage costs are the most important domestic cost factor. So if the level of wage costs go up, the inflation goes up, the price level goes up. And so if the trade unions demand compensation for the cut in real wages caused by the depreciation, the depreciation will not work. This is expressed that no real depreciation took place. We had a nominal depreciation, but this was compensated by inflation. What could trade unions do? I think it should be clear it is different groups of workers are differently affected. First, employed workers have to accept a cut in real wages. Unemployed workers, at least after some time, will enjoy higher employment, so the unemployment rate will go down. But so we have maybe conflicts between different groups in society. Also, middle classes in many cases don't like a depreciation because then they cannot buy all the nice foreign fancy cars and French wine and etc. So you may have a political conflict. I think what would be the best model is to have a kind of social contract. That means you have a kind of round table with the government, and all groups in society, all main groups, trade unions, employees associations, government, agree to have a depreciation, a one-time depreciation, and the trade unions accept a cut in real wages, and they get for that an increase in employment. But let me tell you the truth: if trade unions don't accept, the central bank will create a crisis, or a financial crisis will come if the current account deficit cannot be financed. So that might be still the best option, in spite of the fact that it is really not very nice for the people employed. Maybe so far, maybe it is very controversial, maybe we could discuss this. There are three more problems of a depreciation, maybe, but I would like to stop now.
Great, thank you very much to have this very, it's a very controversial issue, and it really needs a lot of political efforts and to work on that. Yes, so now we are open for the questions. So please, we're very privileged to have Professor here, and you can ask any question more direct also, please. Oh, is it too technical? Yes, Philip, please go ahead.
Okay, here in South Africa, we've got, okay, when we borrow money from World Bank or from IMF, the interest rate is 1.1%. But it looks small, but if you compare to dollars, I mean, if you look in South Africa in 2000, 1 rand, it was 7 rand to dollar. And now the dollar has gone up. It's like 1 rand is to 14, 15, almost 20 rand sometimes. So meaning when we borrow money, we're taking in a very bad money and then taking out a good money, which is getting us cornered in every time. And yet, I mean, there's the money which is for government employee pension funds, and then it's about maybe trillions of rands. So why can't, when the government is in trouble, why can't we take that money and then our own money and then use it for the problems that we have, and then not take the money from which is getting us into trouble? And then sure, we can, yeah, that's what I can say so far.
Okay, thank you. Very nice intervention. Let me discuss the problem, which happened hundreds of times in especially in countries in the global south. For any reason, the country comes in a situation of a current account deficit, and in many cases, this current account deficit was created because of high capital inflow, usually in form of credit. one of the key problems, economists call that original sin of developing countries. So a sin, but they are not responsible for that, so to speak, yeah, is that the foreign credit will be denominated in foreign currency, in dollar. As I've mentioned, when South Africa gets help from the IMF, or when South Africa takes a foreign credit, this credit is in US dollar. Even if the interest rate is, let's say, 1%, this credit can become extremely expensive. It becomes expensive if the rand depreciates. Because let's say the rand depreciates 30%, then any domestic debtor in South Africa indebted in dollars must earn 30% more rent to pay back the credit, because when the domestic debtor in South Africa goes to the foreign exchange market to get the dollars, he has to pay 30% more. So that means I think trade unions should recommend to the own government never take credit in foreign currency, because this is extremely dangerous. And South Africa is suffering also from such a situation. This is one of the additional points. If a country has a high level of foreign debt, it's almost not possible to depreciate. Yeah, let's say you have 50–60% of your GDP foreign debt. You find countries with that percentage, and if the country depreciates, immediately domestic debtors cannot pay back. So I think that's very, very important. I think also for trade unions to understand that foreign debt is sweet poison, and countries should be extremely cautious to take foreign credit. Yeah, but let's say if a country now has a deficit, it has lost competitiveness, it's not competitive. That means exports are not very good, imports are high. So the country is not competitive. And it has a current account deficit, trade deficit. So you can avoid a depreciation if you take more foreign credit, if you create more capital inflows. But the story is always the same. We have a kind of what is called boom-bust cycle. You have a phase of 5 years, 6 years, even 8, 9 years, capital inflows, everything looks good, but suddenly the capital inflow stops. And then the depreciation comes. There's no option. Yeah, the exchange rate just will collapse. The country then, of course, can go to the International Monetary Fund to ask for help, but the International Monetary Fund or foreign governments may help, but only under certain conditions. And because the IMF does not want to finance that country forever, the IMF will also demand for depreciation. So the depreciation comes anyway. So that means if a country moves in such a constellation, it might much better if the depreciation comes before the crisis becomes open and all groups in society agree we need a depreciation and we have to accept a depreciation will reduce our living standard. But there is no option because the country lives beyond its means. And it only can avoid the depreciation if foreign countries finance the country. But this will come to an end. So there's no option. So better is to do it in an organized way, to accept the cut in real wages, than to have a crisis in which you have really extreme stabilization crisis, probably. We know that from Argentina, we know it from the Asian crisis, we know it from Ukraine, we know it from many countries. that such a external financial crisis becomes very, very costly. So it's better to do it before. And trade unions should understand that how dangerous it is to have a high current account deficit to accumulate foreign debt.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. I think that's very important for the trade unions to understand this logic. It's very firmly and very, very good, because that's part of the education. Otherwise, we need to participate in this macro management and have the voice, or somehow to understand this logic. Otherwise, it does not make sense. So we have a question from Mr. Sahu. I will read here. It's observed that many of Latin American countries are suffering from high degree inflation. What's wrong with the industrial and macroeconomic policies, and what are the impacts on working class?
Yes, this leads me to a very, very difficult topic. Very difficult topic. Basically, we have three sources of inflation. The first source is we have, let's call it kind of exogenous shocks. This is a bad harvest, increase in natural resource prices, increase in taxes, consumption taxes or value-added tax. So these are not really totally exogenous, but they are, let's say they are politically decided, or they really are shocks. Or real estate prices go up. So this is one group of factors. It's obvious if you have a bad harvest and the price for rice or maize goes up, you have an inflationary push. The second group is, or the second big factor is depreciation. Depreciation can be a major cause also for increase of price level, because we have discussed that if you depreciate, all imported goods increase in price. Yeah, let's say if a country has no oil, the country depreciates, the oil price goes up, and because the oil price goes into many products, this cost push inflation works through the whole economy. And now comes the controversial point. The main domestic factor for inflation are wage costs. Actually, in most countries, wage costs are the most important factor for inflation. This leads to the conclusion, and this is very difficult to understand for trade unionists. This leads to a conclusion as a working class as a whole, the working class as a whole cannot achieve any substantial redistribution by increasing wages. If they try to do that, they just increase inflation. That means a very aggressive wage policy will lead to inflation. But this is not the typical case. The typical case when we look at inflationary processes is we have exchange rate movement, a depreciation, we have an oil price shock, and real wages go down, and then this inflation, not starting with the wages, leads to a wage inflation, and then you have a kind of spiral. So to sum up, as a trade union in a single industry, you can increase your real wage by pushing up wages. If in other sectors wages do not go up. But if in all sectors you have an increase in wages, you cannot bite into profits. It's limited. Under certain conditions you can do, but it's very limited. And we don't live in a paradise in capitalism. Capitalists are stronger. they can always increase prices. So this makes it very, very difficult to bite into profits. There's actually only one realistic chance to bite into profits. If you have a trade unions in an oligopoly or monopoly company, this is Kalecki's argument, yeah, economist, then you can increase wages, costs go up. But if the company rolls over all costs to the prices, the company suffers from demand. So the company will optimize how much it will increase the price. But then really workers can bite into profits of the single company. But if you have no oligopolies, monopolies, trade unions cannot bite into profits, only in certain sectors, but as a class not. So when you ask why Latin American countries suffer from inflation, let's say compared to Asian countries, it is the logic that you have some factors which pushes the price level up. The unions increase nominal wages increase faster than productivity, then wage costs go up, and then you have this kind of inflationary climate, these wage price spirals, not necessarily started by wages. So you have, let's say, the kind of culture of a wage price spiral, as you used to have the same culture in Southern European countries before the European Monetary Union, yeah? And this is the explanation. That it's not very nice for unions to understand that as a class of workers, you cannot bite much into profits, and too high wage increases will lead to inflation, and with all the negative effects, restrictive monetary policy, etc., what can follow from that?
Yes, thanks, Professor. That's really hard, actually. But also, like, I was also thinking as what you were saying, like someone can gain, some can lose. But in these cases, do you support with this sectoral collective bargaining? Because in the same time, it looks like not really every wage of the worker is going to goes up. So in these cases, how much degree that this can actually contribute to less growth of these inflations? No.
Actually, the best model, the best wage bargaining model would be sectoral bargaining, but at the same time, a kind of coordination of wage development among the different sectors. That would mean the trade unions from the different sectors have to sit together and to discuss how should wages in the country develop, yeah? What is our wage demand? And then you could have some differentiations, but more or less in all sectors, wages should increase with the same percentage. I mean, the extreme model is a Swedish, Norwegian, Danish model in the past, Austrian model in the past, countries with very low inflation. These countries negotiated for the whole country on the central level. You had really national negotiations. The central bank president, the government, the trade union president, and the employers president were sitting together and discussing how should wages develop, and then that was realized. So you need a certain coordination. Otherwise, there's a danger that in some sectors wages increase very quickly, and in this sector, really real wage increases can be the outcome of wage negotiations. I don't know whether I should discuss this more, explain this more. I don't know whether this should be our topic here.
Yes, is there any more questions? Otherwise, we can elaborate. It's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, maybe Professor, you can go ahead to elaborate a little more. Yeah.
Okay, let's make an example. Let's say we have in the trade unions for our train system, yeah, for our trains is demanding very high wages. By the way, we have a industrial action with a very moderate wage demands, yeah, just 1 point something per year. That's very actually too low, yeah. But let's assume we would have in this public transport in the train system a trade union pushing up wages 20-30%. Okay, the train company will increase prices accordingly. Otherwise, the company would go bankrupt. Yeah, so it would increase the price. Now, of course, the workers in the train sector earn 30% more. The inflation rate in the country will slightly go up because train services are only a very small part of the inflation basket. So the workers in this train sector will gain, and all the rest of society will lose a little bit because they now have to pay more for using the train. So you have a redistribution, let's say, from other workers using the train to the workers using in the train sector. So that makes sense, perfectly sense for the train union to push up wages. The problem is if all unions in all sectors do it, then you have a problem. Then you have prices going up in all sectors and nobody gains. Or you have a situation in South Africa, you have sectors with very strong unions, the mining sector, pushing up wages. In the retail sector, in the domestic worker sectors, very weak unions, don't push up wages. Then you have an extreme unequal income distribution within the working class. That also could be the result. So from, in my opinion, the best model would be a horizontal coordination of wage development. If miners increase wages in the retail sector and domestic worker sectors, wages should increase with the same percentage. It's very difficult to realize. For that, you need very strong unions. You need unions thinking in a macroeconomic way. It's not many countries are able to do that. However, we should be clear that in the traditional Scandinavian countries, or in the past also changed a lot now, in the Scandinavian countries, this model worked perfectly, and it led to relatively low income inequality, etc. Yeah, but it's very difficult to achieve. And it's also clear if you have such horizontal coordination of wages, it's also relatively easy to depreciate and convince the whole union movement that a depreciation may be necessary for the stability of the whole country. But if you have weak unions, you probably cannot demand that these unions act in a macroeconomic responsible way. It simply, they have no instruments to act in a macroeconomic responsible way. But at least on the theoretical debate, this should be taken into account.
Yes, that's great. That's great. I mean, at least helped me to understand these horizontal coordinations. When we're talking about wage distributions, they're not only about in this way, but also in a way when we're demanding for increasing of the wage. Great. Yes, please, Indira, it's your floor.
Following on what you're saying, Hansjorg, so the model of centralized and coordinated bargaining of the Scandinavian countries, it's also a model that kind of developed at the stage in which the the country has more or less established kind of a welfare system in which, you know, people had access to free healthcare and free education and so on. So the question really becomes, does that model come out? Is the model outcome of, let's say, a period in which the country, which the country develops, or can the model, should it be a precondition? And do we have cases in which it has been a precondition that has led to this one? Because it's very difficult to argue. If I take my own country, for instance, if you have to pay for healthcare, you have to pay for education, and, you know, and then food is expensive, and then you ask workers to even bear with with such an expensive costs that they have to pay monthly, it's very difficult to convince them for actually accepting that one. So I'm just thinking, how does that work together with the welfare state rather than just, you know, seeing it as a separate kind of strategy?
Yes, I think this let's say this horizontal kind of wage coordination, it is, I think, it's not very common it's not very common in the typical country in the global south. I think the institutions are missing, and also the welfare state probably is missing, and I think it also only worked in the developed world, and it's eroding. It's also it's very, very clear this model is eroding. Let's take the German model. We had also a high horizontal coordination in Germany until German unification. After that, now it's eroding. In Germany, it worked in the following way: the metal industry started the wage round, and this had a signal for all other sectors. This is so-called pattern bargaining. But I think it's only possible, this kind of horizontal coordination which prevents high inequality. I mean, to very clear about that, the key source of inequality in the global south is wage dispersion, not the distribution between profit and wages. The key source of inequality is wage dispersion, and this has to do that coordinated wage development is not possible, yeah. But this is very difficult to achieve, and it's eroding. And this is one explanation why inequality in all countries in the world are increasing. But I think trade unions at least should be clear about this. And if trade unions think in a microeconomic way, then of course they just push for their own increase in real wages, or for the worst thing is this firm-based wage negotiations. Yeah, this is recommended by the World Bank, then IMF. Yeah, they argue if you have wage negotiations, let's have it on the firm level. Then you have this forgotten completely the macroeconomic dimension. Yeah, and I would like that trade unions start to think in macroeconomic ways, at least reflect what could be macroeconomic policy, including macroeconomic based wage policy. Yeah, but it's difficult. Elia, you're right. It's maybe not possible. Just think of a country like Bangladesh or India. It simply is also institutions are missing, unions are divided. You know, it will not work. It's simply not possible. But then unions will remain weak. They will not play a big role in the transformation of a country. They will not play a big role how the country develops. And if the trade union want to have an influence, then they have to start to think in a macroeconomic way.
Great. Yes. So as unions, we should also bear this mindset, at least now, to take at this macro management levels. And that's also somehow connected with the second question. As you also highlight in the end of the video lecture, the importance of the transparency and engagement of trade unions in the macro management of industry policies. Actually, it was hard for me to understand before, but now I understand. And so many of our course participants also pointed out there is a practical or maybe the mere approach for trade unions in their country is through the participation of the tripartite social dialogue. However, it is very, very limited, and trade unions often have limited technical capacity in dealing with. I mean, when we're talking about these technical issues on like depreciation of national currency, exchange rate, these kind of things. So as you already talk many things on the wage policies, we would also want to know like what are other areas of the macro management that trade unions are relatively easy to engage. And are there any good examples to empower workers and engage them in the macro management of industrial policy discussions? And some countries, I mean, have good examples. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think this also very much depends on the strengths of the trade union movement. I think what of course is very, very important is education and creating knowledge. I mean, take Germany again as an example. In Germany, we are very lucky. We have our own very strong trade union research institute, a big foundation, the Hans Böckler Foundation, and it is one of the top research institutes accepted by other research institutes, in spite that it has, in many cases, a different opinion. And such a research institute, of course, is producing a lot of knowledge. It's also recommending what kind of wage policy would be suitable, and it commands fiscal policy, industrial policy, etc. And in many other European countries, and I think also in the United States, there are some trade union research institutes, and I think they play a key role to give advice to the union leaders and also to take part in the debate and also to educate trade union members. In some countries in the global south, this also works. But in other countries, especially if the union movement is very weak, that's difficult to do. But we have our Global Labor University, and the Global Labor University exactly has the purpose to do that. I can give you an example. So the Global University now invited 6-7 trade unionists from Belarus, and they will stay here 1 year, and we have a special program for them to educate them in economic and political areas, with the explicit purpose, if situations may change, probably may change in Belarus, they can go back and start a kind of very small kind of trade union research institute to take part in the debate about wage policy, fiscal policy, exchange rate policy, industrial policy, etc. Because so far the trade unions in Belarus and the whole movement is not very well educated in macroeconomic dimensions. So I think depending on the strengths of trade unions, they should start to create some institution for analyzing the domestic situation, to advise trade union leaders what are the debates and what would be a position for the trade unions, and then at least take part in the debate.
Great, Professor. That was my question purpose for. another promotion for our Global Labor University.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. Sahu, would you like to talk a little bit? Can we also comment? I mean, rather than I read for you.
No, actually, just I wanted to share. Actually, I worked there for 4 years. So, yeah, and it has 56 offices. This Central Board for Workers' Education. So they are also, and basically it is a government organization, and it was created in the year 1956 after the country got independence. So there was a period where the trade union movement was held. Nowadays also they are working, but particularly on this trade union, they are not educating. They are more on increasing productivity, how to reduce absenteeism. This kind of topic means that suits the industries. These kind of topics are being discussed. But in the initial phases, how to set up trade union under the Trade Union Acts, etc., were taught under this organization. But this organization is still working. This is what I wanted to share with you.
Yeah, very good. I think what I did not mention, trade unions can also try to find progressive academics, to try to work together with progressive academics in the country to for education and developing own ideas.
Yes, Indirena, please go ahead.
Yeah, Hansjorg, at the end of your video lecture, you mentioned shortly about also transparency and participation of trade unions, in the policies of central banks and so on. Now, for many years, central banks, at least in our part of the world, have kind of been declared independent from politics. And I think that was a requirement of the World Bank, actually, to have the central bank independent, and then to sort of give priority to technocrats by saying it's just a technocratic issue, right? So I'm just wondering to what extent has this kind of policies that were really recommended to our countries have aggravated the problems, by leaving the central banks somehow outside of these broader policy discussions.
Thank you. Yes, this is to have an independent central bank was one of the 20 commands of the Washington Consensus. So that was a strong recommendation. It was even enforced to have an independent central bank. We have different degrees of independence. So the Federal Reserve is much less independent than the European Central Bank, for example. So when you have mentioned transparency, so in the Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, after a few weeks, we know the voting behavior of the members of the Federal Open Market Committee, the committee deciding about monetary policy. We have the minutes of the meetings. The European Central Bank is completely closed. But I think in almost all countries, at least OECD countries, the central banks are now independent. But still, trade unions, of course, can comment, they can debate industrial policy, that this is done in Europe. But of course, this is maybe difficult for some trade union movements to have the institutions for really discussing monetary policy. And it's also clear this is one of the neoliberal strategies to create supranational institutions and then put technocrats on it, or national institutions run by technocrats. This is one strategy by the neoliberals, for example, Mr. Hayek, one of the godfathers of the neoliberals, he exactly recommended this technocratic leadership. Why? He did not believe in democracy. He believed if we allow democracy to become too strong, people will demand redistribution and they may demand welfare states, etc. And he did not want to have that. Yeah, it's clear trade unions should argue against such technocratic leadership and should push for more democratic structures. For example, Joseph Stiglitz, very famous American, US American economist, argued we should change that. We don't need independent central banks. Also, central banks should be democratically controlled and run. Yeah, but there are many other areas which are closer to trade unions, so fiscal policy, labor market policy, and such things that are relatively close to what trade unions can directly contribute.
Excellent. Yes, Philip, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, Prof, this morning, the Minister of Industry and Economy on the newspaper, it said that he encourages a local economy, like people should produce and buy locally. And then his colleagues, I mean, they countered that okay, I mean, they call him, he's been a coward because he doesn't want to compete. Instead of encouraging competition, now he wants to do the local thing. And then that would also, the want is gonna get the country into trouble because of its free trade agreement, which the country has signed. And then now this multi-cooperation will take the country into to court and so on. And then, okay, again, Prof, and then there was no trade union. There's no one from the trade union to raise the voice and side with the minister. And then, okay, again, you said you advise workers to take a pay cut. Okay, as Edler said earlier on, that, okay, how do you take a pay cut? Here in South Africa, I mean, people have, if you want your kids to go to school, to go for education, service delivery is very bad. You have to pay for everything. And then again, on top of that, you said about localization, people should buy local. So isn't like when people have money in their pocket and the economy circulate, so it doesn't mean when people have extra money, they are able to buy, and like that, jobs are being created. So I'd like to get your clarification on that. And then again, do you what do you think of AGOA? AGOA is African Growth Opportunity Act agreement, which apparently it was unilaterally formed by America. Because here in South Africa, it has already caused us problem. Like, okay, what's happening in AGOA? It claims that, okay, like you've got your wine, you've got your fruits, workers working in the farm, and then those products are sold in America, and then they're not being taxed, or they're taxed at a very little amount. And then there was a situation a few years ago, America imposed that South Africa must take chickens from America. And then there was a complaint that if we take chickens from America, now what about our own chickens here in South Africa? Because there's a lot of chicken farming, And then also it's going to threat a lot of workers are going to lose jobs, and a lot of workers have lost jobs because of these chickens coming from America. And then America threatened South Africa. If you don't take my chickens, then I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop you from this AGOA. I'm gonna cut you from AGOA. And then South Africa had to accept the chickens, and then because it was scared workers will lose jobs in the farms. So okay, sorry. Okay,
thanks, Felix. You know, let's also give some time for the professor to answer your many big questions. Yeah, please go ahead, Professor.
Okay, thank you for the interesting questions. First, pay cuts. I don't argue for pay cuts. In the only under certain conditions, it's unavoidable. Let's say in a normal situation, in a country, in a stable situation, the recommendation would be that wages increase according to productivity plus target inflation rate of the central bank. The best guideline would be to take productivity of the whole industrial sector or of the whole economy. Let's say you have productivity development of 3%, and the inflation rate should be 3%, then every year wages should go up 6%. Then you would have increasing costs of 3%, increasing wages of 6%, your real wages would go up 3%. And the best model would be to take as guideline not firm-specific productivity, not sectoral productivity, but national productivity as a guideline. And then you real wages would permanently increase based on productivity increases. The wage cuts are only necessary if the country is in a crisis situation, if it has accumulated high current account deficits. There's anyway no option. Sooner or later, a depreciation will come because a crisis will be created. So wage cuts actually should only take place in a crisis situation as a short or medium term measure to stabilize the economy. Otherwise, as long as productivity increases, real wages should increase. Of course, if productivity is not increasing in a country, what is not the case, and in all countries, at least so far, productivity is increasing. But if productivity would not increase, you could only increase real wages by redistribution. But in my opinion, this policy has certain limitations. To a certain extent, it may work, but this is why trade unions also should push for productivity development. Trade unions should also care that the country increases productivity, because this is the basis for increasing real wages. So normally, real wages should permanently increase according to productivity. With a local economy, also a very important point. We have discussed that before. One policy would be to increase transportation costs, or also industrial policy to strengthen local networks. And you're right, in many cases, free trade agreements make that difficult. So I know South Africa terminated some of the free and investment agreements. That's possible. So we have to keep in mind that the rules of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, are relatively good compared to the free trade investment agreements. So, but these trade and investment agreements, countries can get rid of that. So that might be necessary to really create local networks. And you are right, with the agricultural sector, there are many examples, not only chicken. I know another example that Europe exported milk powder, because it produced too much milk powder to Africa, and destroyed farming in Africa, etc. So it is really necessary, and trade unions also should push for that. Countries should have the freedom to protect themselves against such policies which are very harmful for the country. So that's create more freedom for industrial policy and for national policies. This is, I think, an important point.
Great. Thanks very much, Professor. I think this is an area which we are, as trade unions and as scholars, we should also focus on. And a very wonderful discussion today. We have covered a lot of critical areas. Some of the areas are very controversial, but that's the thing. We have to try to understand these controversialities. So very great. Thank you so much, Professor, again. And thank you very much for participating.